Joining us now from Tel Aviv is the spokesman for Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Paul Hirschson. Thanks so much for joining us. I have to ask you this question. Hamas said Monday that it would not agree to a ceasefire until Israel until its demands were met. Israel's defense minister says the operation would continue as long as necessary. What are the prospects of this conflict coming to an end anytime soon?
This is an excellent question. You know, we didn't want to be in this conflict in the first place. From the 12th of June until the 7th of July for about 3 weeks when Hamas increased significantly the number of missiles coming into Israel. We said repetitively, we said it openly, we said it privately through diplomatic channels that quiet will be answered with quiet. This was rejected out of hand by Hamas, and we were left with no choice but to go into this conflict. We've had 3 ceasefires that we've accepted and implemented. And Hamas, with a kind of a glib, blasé, couldn't care less attitude, has ignored them. So your question is an excellent question, and the answer to it lies in this here, and that is when we are confident, fully confident, that the threat, a very stark threat to our public in Israel has rescinded, either through military means or hopefully through diplomatic means, then it will end.
You know, isn't there a dilemma for you in Israel? You know, as the public outcry grows, the civilian death toll mounts, there is international pressure on Israel. But at the same time, you can't declare victory until that rocket threat that you've just talked about is gone. This is a big problem for you, right?
Look, 2 things. First of all, we're not particularly interested in declaring victory per se. What we're interested in is securing a sense of calm and normalcy for the public here in Israel. Secondly, I must add, it's not only the rocket threat. As you have probably seen over the last few days, the second arm, as it were, of Hamas's military strategy has emerged from underground. Hundreds of tunnels, 4 meters underground, tens of which penetrating across the international frontier into Israel, tunnels which you can drive vehicles through with oxygen supply, with electricity supply, out of which they're injecting their terrorist forces into Israel with a view to wreak havoc and death and destruction in Israel. So it's a 2-pronged strategy, both of which we are cutting back piece by piece. We estimate their rocket and missile supplies, as it were, to have been depleted by over 50% by now. And in these terror tunnels, we have taken over 23 of those that penetrate the international frontier, and we're in the process of decommissioning them, and some 70 terror tunnel shafts, access shafts to others that we're in the process of decommissioning.
You say death and destruction. There's been a lot of death and destruction in Gaza as well, a rising civilian death toll. I want to just play for you Hannah Ashwari, the spokesperson for Palestinian Authority, and get your reaction to what she says off the back.
It's nothing short of a massacre, a deliberate massacre, war crimes committed daily. But now there's a deliberate shelling and bombing and destruction of whole areas, of residential areas. And not only do they shell people's homes and kill them in cold blood, as they're leaving, as they're running away, they're being shelled and bombed and killed.
Your reaction to that?
It's very interesting what the piece you just played from Hanan Ashrawi. She did not once mention the word Israel, and it's perhaps not a surprise. Hanan Ashrawi is in a particularly uncomfortable position right now, in that I think the only people Hamas dislike more than us here in Israel is the people that Hanan Ashrawi represent, the Fatah leadership of the Palestinians in what we lovingly call the West Bank.
Sorry to interrupt. That aside, sorry, just for clarification. She is basically pointing out that she feels that Palestinians, regardless whether they're Fatah or Hamas, are being massacred in their homes by Israeli forces. Can you respond to that directly?
Well, what I will agree is that there is a real human tragedy underway, particularly in Gaza right now, the fault of which lies directly and the responsibility at the doorstep of Hamas. Let me be clear. The Palestinian people are not our enemy, and the Israeli military is doing everything it can, taking unprecedented steps to avoid and to minimize civilian casualties. But there are two things that we have to understand, one of which is precisely why we didn't want to be dragged to this conflict in the first place, is that in conflict, in combat, there is no such thing as civilians not getting caught up in the fighting, and that is the great tragedy of it. And the other is that Hamas is committing a war crime here. They're committing a double war crime. The one which we all know is that they are deliberately trying to kill and murder Israeli civilians, but the other is that they are deliberately, actively, unashamedly putting the Palestinian population in the line of fire, using them as human shields, discouraging them, and in some cases preventing them from taking heed of the very specific warnings which the military is giving as to when and where strikes will be, in order, almost one gets a sense, to generate death amongst their own people.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but in the end, these Palestinian civilians are being killed by Israeli bullets and bombs. And in Gaza, as you know, it's a very dense population, and some would argue that some of the strikes have not been precision-style strikes, but actually have hit families that have nothing to do with Hamas.
The Israeli military only targets legitimate military targets, and the process for selecting such targets is a long process, including multiple layers of intelligence, including legal consultation, judicial oversight, and significant training of the officers at the operational level. But it's not a pure science. And I said to you already, and that's precisely the reason why we didn't want to be dragged into this conflict. Civilians get caught up. Now it's early days yet. The details will come out only long after the fighting is over as to who was killed by whose bullets. And I think it's this trade in blood is a somewhat distasteful thing to do, because it disguises a little bit the reality of it. It's not for want of trying that Hamas has not killed hundreds of people across Israel.
Sure.
Look, some 2,000 rockets and missiles have been fired into Israel. The government of Israel is left with no choice, as has said just today, just an hour ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, who is in Israel right now, who has said that Israel is facing a stark threat and has the right to self-defense.
Have you been surprised by the
Correct.
resistance of Hamas and the extent of their network? Is this why we're seeing an escalation, not the pinpoint operation that was promised?
I don't think there's a black and white answer to that. In general, no. I think that our intelligence, which has been accumulated over the last months, was fairly good. We're not that surprised. There's real resistance. There's real combat going on there. What has emerged is a monster from underground. Look, we in the West, we in Israel, who place at the very focus of our discourse the rights and the freedom of the individual, find ourselves up against a school of thought which has elevated suicide to a place in society which amounts to nothing less than the worship of death.
You say worship of death. You have been
Yes.
very adamant in your opposition to Hamas, calling it a terrorist organization. This is the third time that you've gone into Gaza since you unilaterally pulled out in 2005. Is this an admission that basically that was a mistake, that, if Hamas is still such a threat, why don't you go in and reoccupy the Strip?
Look, this is an excellent question. We, 9 years ago, 2005, we redeployed out of Gaza. We exhumed the bodies of Israelis who had died and been buried close to home in order to leave the place empty of any site of Israel, in the hope that they would, build Dubai on the Mediterranean coast. And instead, as we've all seen, they invested in hate and they invested in arms. The question is, are we going to put a Band-Aid for a third time on this problem, which is something we don't want to do, or are we going to get to a point where it has become clear to everybody around the world that Gaza needs to be demilitarized?
One question we must ask you, news in the last 24 hours, confirmation that a 21-year-old sergeant from the Israeli Defense Force, Oren Shor, has been captured by Hamas. What can you tell us about this? And obviously, parallels are being drawn with Gilad Shalit's capture in 2005. And has this latest shoulder become a bargaining chip as the previous one was?
Allow me, if you will, to say to you that, only one thing on this particular issue, and that is that it's a completely different scenario to what was with Gilad Shalit. And if you'll forgive me, I apologize. I cannot go any further into that particular issue.
Just one quick follow-up. Hamas bargained 1,000 prisoners for that previous soldier. One of their demands for ending the conflict now would be the release of recently rearrested prisoners. Do you see that happening in return for the soldier?
I don't think that Hamas right now is in the position to put too many demands out there. I think the world has seen a brutal killer strategy come up emerge out of below the earth. And I think right now the focus is on the Israeli military doing the work that it has to do in order to remove this threat.